Well, there was much happening at the state capitol this past week. Tax cuts, tax hikes, highways, redistricting, and competition for a balanced budget. Lots to analyze. Joining me now is Jason Tolbert, our content partner with the Tolbert Report, an online blog covering Capitol politics. Jason, as always, good to have you.
Good to be here today.
Well, we've been talking for weeks about tax cuts at the legislature. Let's talk about tax increases first. There are three significant proposals being discussed that could impact taxes. One would collect more severance tax. A second would raise diesel fuel taxes for roads. And a third is going to raise the half-cent sales tax for roads. Those last two are going to require general election approval from voters. But all of these tax bills have presented a particularly tricky situation for Republicans. Why don't you explain?
You're right. And it's been interesting to watch this past week as the dialogue has shifted away from tax cuts and instead into tax increases. The two you mentioned that would fund roads, the half percent sales tax and the 5-cent diesel tax, both would be referred to the voters. So that won the support of about half the Republican caucus, and they basically said, this has to go to the voters for their approval, so we can support sending out a tax increase as long as it does give the voters an opportunity to vote up or down on that.
And we had some drama on the floor of the House on Friday, as well as in a committee with two of those potential tax increases. Kind of tell me, what has been the fallout or the reaction from Republicans to the Republicans that supported those measures?
Well, I think it's taken a lot of Republicans by surprise. Of course, many Republicans saw the proposal by Representative Jonathan Burnett, who is a former highway commissioner, and came forward with his proposal to fund highway construction. But it surprised a lot of Republicans that this many signed on to it. I mean, it looks like, as I said, roughly half the caucus ended up supporting it today. So there's going to be interesting to see if there's any pushback from the party faithful on that. I think you'll see some Republicans that are upset that Republicans voted for a tax increase in the current environment.
All right, back to tax cuts, Jason. There are about 8 to 10 tax cutting proposals that have made their way through half of the legislative process. Either the House has passed them or the Senate, but not vice versa. Do you think that there's a consensus on which tax cuts may make it through?
Not really. I believe the grocery tax probably has the most widespread support. I can't see how that one doesn't eventually make it out. But the other ones, it's difficult to figure out what exactly is going to play out. The Senate and the House are sort of in a game of chicken to see who's going to blink and who's going to win out on those. I think we'll see some committee hearings on those this next week, or perhaps the one after that will kind of determine how that shakes out. A lot of the smaller tax cuts, I think, will eventually make their way through. The biggest one that's in limbo really is the capital gains tax cut, and that one is really in doubt if it can make it through, just because of the size that DFA has assigned it on the revenue projection.
Well, tax cuts do have some bearing on how the state budget is balanced. This week we learned that there's a good chance we're going to have some competing balanced budget proposals for the very first time. How might this happen?
Well, there were two bills introduced that with the Revenue Stabilization Act bills. The first time that's ever happened. And so we have one that's sort of the main one that would come from the majority party. But then Representative Lee also filed, it's a shell bill at this point, but she filed one that would offer the minority party a chance to propose an alternate Revenue Stabilization Act bill that would probably be a reduction in the size of government. It's interesting to see exactly how big that reduction may be, but it would give those who got elected on the promise to reduce the size of state government the opportunity to vote for an alternate budget bill rather than just against the main budget bill.
Yeah, and I would argue that this could be a win-win for the Republicans because only a simple majority is needed to pass the Revenue Stabilization Act. Republicans could vote for Lee's smaller government alternative. The Democrats' bigger budget bill passes, and the GOP gets a political wedge issue for next year's campaigns.
Sure, and you could even actually see some conservative Democrats cross over and vote for the smaller bill as well. It's no really telling which bill may win out. It would offer some political cover, but there's a good chance the smaller bill actually might be the one that gets approved.
All right, interesting to watch. Well, we thought we dealt with this earlier in the session, health care reform. Senator Missy Irvin brings a bill before a House committee calling for details of how much implementation of federal health care could cost the state. It failed on a party line vote. It's kind of a simple enough concept when you hear it generically, but really The language in the bill is what tanked it, right?
Sure, it's one of those the devil's in the details type bills. The bill itself is something that I would think almost anyone would support, and that's to create more accountability in the implementation of the health care bill, the federal health care bill, to track the cost, to track what all has to be done to implement that. But some in the majority party were concerned about some of the elements that gave the state legislature the power to perhaps not approve some of those initiatives, and they were concerned that it perhaps maybe gave too much power to the state. Of course, the Republicans had no problem giving that additional power to the state, as they profess to believe in the state's rights and the state's right to do that. So that's kind of where that got hung up. I don't know that bill is dead. My read is that there's still some behind-the-scenes negotiation. I think we may see some bill get passed that creates some sort of cost tracking mechanism for those federal health care reforms that are coming down the pipe.
All right, the state agencies committees are going to be working some overtime in the next few weeks. We got redistricting and constitutional amendments. Let's go redistricting first. How many different plans are going to be floated out there, and what do you see ultimately happening?
Well, that's a good question as to how many. The two basic debates right now are whether to just basically leave the congressional districts as they are, pretty much intact, and make some changes around the edges, around the border, to adjust for the changes in population, the way the population has shifted over the last 10 years. And on the other side of that is the debate of whether to make some more massive reforms that would kind of restructure how the map looks. And then within that debate, there's debate as to how those reforms would look. There's talk, of course, of creating a minority-majority district, or at least an almost minority-majority district. And there's talk of maybe actually there being the Black Caucus, the Legislative Black Caucus, and the Republican Caucus maybe uniting together to support that. Of course, there's also talk as to how you would just shift around the second district and the third district. The third district obviously has to lose quite a few people. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens, whether it's just going to be some minor tweaking around the edges or whether it's going to be a huge shift in the way the congressional map looks.
Yeah, I'm not sure what scenario plays out. I just don't think there's going to be a consensus on anything radical, which means that a slightly modified map may ultimately rule. But I can tell you from talking to leaders working on it in both chambers, they don't know what the outcome's going to be.
No, you're exactly right. And I think a lot of times when you see that, when there's a lot of different ideas as to how to radically change things, you end up basically not doing any radical changes, and you just make some small changes to adjust for population. I would not be surprised if that ends up what happens, just because there's so many different ideas that are floating out there.
On to constitutional amendments. You have to think that Representative Barnett's half-cent sales tax for road proposal might be one of the three that's referred by the legislature for voters. Any sense of what the other two might be?
No, it's difficult to tell. There's 25 proposals out there right now, and of course only the top three get through. Representative Barnett's has gotten a lot of attention this week because of Speaker Moore's similar proposal that sort of is a co-package to Barnett's proposal. He's picked up, I think, 74 co-sponsors in the House, so he's gotten a lot of his House members on board. Only got a handful in the Senate, so he's really got his work to do in convincing the Senate that this is the proposal to adopt as well. There was some other tweaking. Senator Madison's proposal on the constables, she changed that where the counties now have the option of whether they want to keep constables as an officer or not. And I think that may get a little bit more support now because some counties may say it makes sense to have constables. Some counties may say we really don't want this office anymore and can do away with it. So that one I think has a chance of getting through after the change she made this week.
And we should point out that they don't have to refer three proposed constitutional amendments. They just have the option to do that. All right, he is Jason Tolbert with the Tolbert Report, which you can catch online at tolbertreport.com. Jason, thanks.
Good to be here.